June the 6th, 1944. Omaha Beach. 0630 hours. The channel was gray and cold, churning with a wind that had nearly postponed the invasion. Obergefreiter Klaus Zimmermann crouched in a concrete bunker overlooking the beach, his hands numb around his MG-42, watching the horizon through a vision slit crusted with salt spray. He had been watching since before dawn, when the naval bombardment began, a rolling thunder that shook dust from the bunker's ceiling and made conversation impossible. Now, as pale light spread across the water, he could see them. Ships, hundreds of ships, more ships than he had ever imagined existed in the world. If you find these stories of courage and strategy inspiring, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support helps us keep these historical legacies alive. They came in waves, emerging from the haze like apparitions. Destroyers and cruisers hurling shells inland, smaller craft, packed, with men racing toward the beach through geysers of German artillery fire. Zimmermann had been told the Atlantic Wall was impregnable. He had been told the Luftwaffe would destroy any invasion fleet. He had been told many things that now seemed like lies whispered in another lifetime. But it was not the destroyers or the landing craft that made Zimmermann's breath catch in his throat. It was the things coming behind them, massive, flat-bottom vessels, each as large as a cargo ship, pushing through the surf with their bows pointed directly at the beach. As Zimmermann watched, the nearest one, gray hull streaked with rust and spray, drove itself onto the sand with a grinding roar. The bow split open, not damaged, not torn by mines or obstacles, but opened, deliberately, like a whale's mouth, and from inside, still dry, still operational, rolled a Sherman tank. Then another. Then another. The tanks drove down the ramp, splashed through waist-deep water, and climbed onto the beach, their engines roaring, their guns already traversing toward German positions. Behind them came trucks, half-tracks, jeeps, artillery pieces towed by tractors, an entire mechanized army pouring out of a ship's belly, delivered not to a port, but directly onto a hostile beach, under fire, as if the ocean itself were merely an inconvenience. Zimmermann turned to his squad leader, a veteran of the Eastern Front, whose face had been carved into permanent hardness by 3 winters in Russia. The man was staring at the beach, mouth slightly open, and for the first time since Zimmermann had known him, he looked afraid. "They brought their tanks across the ocean," the squad leader whispered, "and they opened in the surf." It was a sentence that would echo through the Wehrmacht in the weeks to come, passed from exhausted soldier to soldier in the hedgerows and ruined towns of Normandy. Not a tactical assessment, not a casualty report, just a simple statement of an impossible reality. The Americans had driven ships onto the beach and unloaded tanks as casually as a farmer unloading hay from a wagon, and if they could do that, then the war, perhaps, had already been lost. To understand the shock that rippled through German ranks on D-Day, one must first understand what the Wehrmacht expected an amphibious invasion to look like. The German military, for all its early war successes, had virtually no experience with large-scale amphibious operations. Their closest equivalent was the invasion of Crete in 1941, an airborne assault that succeeded at devastating cost. Amphibious landings, the German High Command believed, required secure ports for disembarkation of heavy equipment. Tanks, artillery, and supplies would be loaded in home ports, transported aboard cargo ships, and then unloaded at captured docks using cranes and stevedores. This assumption shaped the entire defensive strategy for the Atlantic Wall. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, tasked with fortifying the French. Coast focused his efforts on port cities, Cherbourg, Le Havre, Calais. These were ringed with concrete fortifications, minefields, and heavy artillery. Rommel reasoned that an invasion force might land infantry on open beaches, but without a port, they could not sustain offensive operations. Cut off from resupply and heavy weapons, they would wither and die on the shore. The open beaches, places like Normandy, were defended, but less heavily. Obstacles were placed in the surf. Steel hedgehogs, wooden stakes, Belgian gates, all designed to rip out the bottoms of landing craft. Machine gun nests and artillery bunkers covered the beaches. Minefields waited inland. It was a formidable defense, but it was predicated on the belief that the Allies would need weeks to establish a supply line through a captured port. What the Germans did not anticipate was the LST. The landing ship, tank, designation LST, was not a beautiful vessel. It was 328 feet long, flat-bottomed, blunt-bowed, and slow, with a top speed of 12 knots that made it a wallowing target for submarines and aircraft. British sailors jokingly called them large, slow targets. American crews called them large, stationary targets. The LST was designed for one purpose: to carry tanks, trucks, and supplies across open ocean and deposit them directly onto a beach without the need for docks, cranes, or ports. The concept originated with the British in 1940, after the evacuation of Dunkirk exposed the impossibility of evacuating or landing heavy equipment without port facilities. Prime Minister Winston Churchill personally demanded that his military staff design a vessel capable of carrying tanks across the Channel and landing them on beaches. The initial British designs were promising but limited by British industrial capacity. In 1941, Churchill appealed to President Roosevelt for American assistance. The Americans, with their vast shipyards and production capacity, transformed the concept into reality. The LST design was finalized in late 1941, and the first vessel was commissioned in December 1942. The design was brutally simple: a flat-bottomed hull that could be driven directly onto a beach, a large open tank deck capable of carrying up to 20 Sherman tanks or 60 trucks, and a bow fitted with enormous hinge doors that opened via a hydraulic system. The forward section could be ballasted to adjust draft, allowing the ship to approach the shore and then lighten itself for retraction. By June 1944, over 1,000 LSTs had been built in American shipyards. They were produced with the same assembly line efficiency that churned out Liberty ships, jeeps, and bombers: standardized designs, prefabricated components, welded construction. An LST could be built in less than 3 months. They were cheap, they were ungainly, and they were revolutionary. The German intelligence services knew LSTs existed. Reconnaissance photographs from British ports showed the distinctive flat-bottomed hulls, but German analysts consistently underestimated their significance. A 1943 Wehrmacht intelligence report dismissed them as specialized craft suitable only for short-range operations in calm waters. The idea that such vessels could cross the English Channel in rough seas, navigate through minefields and obstacles, and deposit fully operational tanks under fire seemed improbable. On June 6, 1944, that improbability became reality on 5 beaches across Normandy. The German soldiers entrenched along the Normandy coast had expected to fight men. Infantry scrambling from small landing craft, wading through surf under fire, armed with rifles and grenades. This was warfare as they understood it: individual courage tested against firepower, tactics mattering, the skill of the defender counting for something. The Atlantic Wall's bunkers and machine guns were designed for this kind of fight. What they faced instead was industrial war in its purest, most overwhelming form: Lieutenant Arles. Friedrich Müller, commanding a platoon defending a sector of Gold Beach, recorded his experience in a diary recovered after the war. The bombardment lifted at 07:20. We expected the infantry assault. Instead, we saw the ships, the flat ones, dozens of them, driving onto the sand as if the beach were a loading dock. The bows opened. Out came the tanks, not 1 or 2, but a squadron, then another. We engaged with anti-tank guns, but they were already fanning out, moving too fast, supported by infantry we had not yet seen. Within 20 minutes, there were more enemy tanks on the beach than we had in the entire sector. We had prepared to fight soldiers. They sent a factory. This was the essence of the LST's psychological impact. It was not merely that the Allies could land tanks. Theoretically, smaller landing craft could ferry light tanks ashore one at a time. It was the scale and speed. An LST could discharge its entire load in less than an hour, then retract, return to England, reload, and come back. The British beaches, Gold, Juno, Sword, saw over 200 LST landings on D-Day alone. The American beaches, Utah and Omaha, saw similar numbers. By nightfall on June 6th, the Allies had landed over 2,500 vehicles on the Normandy beaches, including more than 600 tanks and self-propelled guns. Not through ports, not through laboriously constructed docks, but directly from ships driven onto the sand, their bows splitting open like the shell of some mechanical crustacean, birthing an armored invasion. The German defenders, even those who held their positions and inflicted grievous casualties, understood that they were witnessing something unprecedented. Oberst Ernst Goth, commanding a regiment near Caen, sent a radio message to his superiors on the evening of D-Day. Enemy has established beachhead with full mechanized support. Recommend immediate armored counterattack with all available reserves. If enemy consolidates current position, we cannot dislodge them. They are landing tanks faster than we can destroy them. The counterattack never came. The panzer divisions that might have driven the Allies back into the sea were held in reserve, awaiting Hitler's personal authorization. The Führer, convinced the Normandy landings were a diversion and the real invasion would come at Calais, refused to commit them until it was too late. By the time German armor arrived in force, the beachhead was secure, reinforced by a tide of men and machines that flowed from the bows of LSTs in an unceasing stream. The symbolism of the LST, its bow doors opening in the surf, transcended its tactical function. It became, in the eyes of both Allies and Axis, a representation of American industrial supremacy and logistical genius. The Germans had built the Atlantic Wall, a static defense of concrete and steel. The Americans had built a mobile port, a fleet of ships that could turn any beach into a harbor. The contrast was stark. Germany, by 1944, was an economy under siege. Allied bombing had devastated rail networks and factories. Fuel shortages crippled mobility. Tank production, despite heroic efforts, could not keep pace with losses on the eastern and western fronts. The Wehrmacht's logistics were increasingly primitive. Horse-drawn wagons supplemented trucks, ammunition was rationed, and entire divisions operated under strength. The United States, by contrast, had transformed itself into what historians would later call the arsenal of democracy. American factories produced 88,000 tanks during the war, 300,000 aircraft, 2,700 Liberty ships, and countless trucks, jeeps, rifles, and shells. The LST, with its mass-produced simplicity and standardized design, epitomized this productive capacity. It was a vessel that could be built by shipyards that had never existed before the war, crewed by sailors who had been farmers and clerks 2 years earlier, and used once or twice before being scrapped or reassigned. The Germans could not match this. They had excellent engineers, skilled workers, and sophisticated designs, but they lacked the raw industrial capacity, the resource base, and the logistical systems to wage war on the American scale. By 1944, this disparity was evident in every engagement. German tanks were superior in armor and firepower. A Panther or Tiger could destroy a Sherman at ranges where the Sherman's gun was useless. But for every Tiger, there were 10 Shermans. And the Shermans kept coming, delivered by LSTs, unloaded in the surf, rolling inland to replace losses faster than German factories could produce replacements. General Oberst Alfred Jodl, chief of the Wehrmacht operations staff, reportedly said in a post-war interrogation, "We knew the Allies had more resources, but seeing ships that were essentially floating ramps, each carrying a battalion's worth of equipment, landing on open beaches, that was when I understood we had lost. Not because of superior tactics or better soldiers, but because they had industrialized invasion. They had reduced amphibious assault to an engineering problem and solved it with welded steel and hydraulics. We could not compete with that." The bow doors of the LST opening in the surf were a symbol of this industrial reality. They represented a nation with such surplus capacity that it could afford to build specialized ships for a single purpose, use them in an operation lasting weeks, and then either scrap them or find new roles. To German observers accustomed to scarcity and improvisation, this wastefulness was both incomprehensible and terrifying. There exists in the Bundesarchiv in Koblenz a collection of after-action reports from German units defending Normandy. One, filed by Major Hans von Luck of the 21st Panzer Division, is particularly revealing. Von Luck, a decorated veteran of the Eastern Front, described his encounter with the Allied beachhead on June 7th, the day after D-Day. "We advanced toward the coast expecting to find confusion. isolated infantry units, perhaps a few light tanks, the typical chaos of an amphibious landing. Instead, we encountered a fully organized defensive perimeter, supported by armor we did not expect. British tanks, recently landed, engaged us at long range. Our intelligence had assured us the enemy would not have heavy equipment for at least a week. Yet, here they were, less than 24 hours after the initial assault, fielding armored units with artillery support. I questioned a captured British soldier, a tank crewman. He told me his tank had been driven onto the beach from a ship, not ferried, not assembled from parts, but driven out fully armed and fueled. He seemed surprised that I found this remarkable. To him, it was routine. He said, "We've been practicing this for a year. Load at Southampton, cross the channel, drive onto the beach, go to war. Simple, really. Simple. As if crossing an ocean with tanks was no more difficult than driving to the market. This, I think, is why we will lose. Not because their soldiers are braver, they are not. Not because their tanks are better, they are not. But because to them, the impossible is merely an engineering problem, and they have the engineers." Von Luck survived the war and wrote extensively about his experiences. His memoirs, published in the 1980s, devoted an entire chapter to the psychological impact of witnessing the LST landings. He described it as a revelation of disparity, the moment when the abstract concept of Allied industrial superiority became concrete reality. Other German accounts echo this theme. Letters intercepted by Allied censors in the weeks following D-Day reveal a common motif, the sense that the Allies were playing a different kind of war, one where resources were unlimited and obstacles were temporary. A letter from an anonymous Luftwaffe pilot dated June 15, 1944, includes the line, "They drive their ships onto the beach and open them like barn doors. We would need cranes and docks to do what they do in the surf. How can we win against such enemies?" The answer, increasingly, was that they could not. The LST's impact extended beyond the immediate tactical advantage. It fundamentally altered the strategic calculus of the campaign. Traditional military doctrine held that an invading force was most vulnerable during the initial landing and the subsequent build-up phase. Defenders could exploit this window to counterattack before the invaders established overwhelming superiority. The Atlantic Wall was designed around this principle: hold the beaches, destroy the ports, and the invasion would collapse under its own logistical weight. The LST shattered this doctrine. By eliminating the need for captured ports, it compressed the vulnerable phase to a matter of days, rather than weeks. The Allies did eventually capture Cherbourg on June 26th, but by then the beachhead was so secure and so well supplied that the port's capture was more convenient than critical. The LSTs had already delivered enough tanks, trucks, artillery, and supplies to sustain offensive operations indefinitely. The numbers bear this out. Between D-Day and the end of June, LSTs transported over 185,000 vehicles and 570,000 tons of supplies directly onto the Normandy beaches. By comparison, the port of Cherbourg, after weeks of repairs to damage inflicted by retreating Germans, handled less cargo in its first month of Allied operation than the LSTs delivered in the first week. This logistical triumph enabled the rapid expansion of the beachhead. Within 2 weeks, the Allies had landed more troops and equipment in Normandy than they had landed in North Africa in 1942, and had done so with far fewer casualties and delays. The German defenders, cut off from reinforcements by Allied air superiority and unable to stem the flow of Allied supplies, fought a grinding, losing battle of attrition. The LST also revolutionized amphibious doctrine for future operations. The Pacific Theater, where island-hopping campaigns required repeated amphibious assaults, saw extensive use of LSTs. The landings at Leyte Gulf, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa all relied on LSTs to deliver armor and supplies directly onto hostile beaches. Japanese defenders, like their German counterparts, were shocked by the speed with which American forces established secure beachheads and brought overwhelming firepower to bear. Admiral Matome Ugaki, Chief of Staff for the Japanese Combined Fleet, wrote in his diary after observing intelligence reports from Normandy, "The Americans have solved the problem of amphibious logistics. They no longer need ports. This makes every coastline vulnerable. Our defensive strategy, predicated on defending key harbors, is obsolete. If they apply this technique in the Pacific, we cannot stop them." Ugaki was correct. The Pacific Island campaigns of 1944 and 1945 demonstrated the same pattern. Initial landings supported by LSTs, rapid buildup of armor and artillery, overwhelming firepower crushing entrenched defenders. The Japanese fought with suicidal courage, but courage could not overcome the logistical reality of an enemy who could deliver an armored division onto a beach in less than a day. There is a photograph, famous among historians, taken on Omaha Beach late in the afternoon of June 6th. In the foreground, an LST sits beached, its bow doors open, a line of jeeps and trucks driving down the ramp onto wet sand. In the middle distance, smoke rises from burning vehicles and German fortifications. In the background, the gray channel churns with more ships approaching, more LSTs, more tanks, more inevitability. The photograph is striking not for its drama. There are more dramatic D-Day images, but for its mundane efficiency. The LST in the frame is not heroic. It is simply functional, a piece of machinery doing its job. The vehicles driving off the ramp are not posed. They are simply moving, part of a conveyor belt of military, force stretching from England to the heart of France. This was the true terror of the LST for German defenders, its ordinariness. It was not a wonder weapon. It was not experimental or fragile. It was reliable, mass-produced, and boring in its competence. It worked, it kept working, and there were hundreds more behind it, each delivering another load, another increment of overwhelming force. By late June, German soldiers in Normandy began to use a new phrase, Die Klappe, the hatch, or the door. It referred to the bow doors of the LST, and it became shorthand for the unstoppable Allied supply line. A soldier might say, Die Klappe has opened, meaning another wave of Allied reinforcements had arrived, or more darkly, Wir können die Klappe nicht schließen, we cannot close the door. This linguistic adaptation, transforming a physical object into a metaphor for inevitability, reveals the psychological impact. The bow doors of the LST had become, in German military, consciousness, a symbol of their own impending defeat. They could fight bravely, skillfully, desperately, but the doors kept opening and the tanks kept coming, and no amount of courage or tactical brilliance could reverse the arithmetic of attrition. Obergefreiter Klaus Zimmermann, the machine gunner who watched the first LSTs land on Omaha Beach, survived the Normandy campaign. He was captured near Falaise in August and spent the remainder of the war in a POW camp in England. In a 1970s interview, recorded by a German television documentary, he was asked what moment made him realize Germany would lose the war. His answer was immediate. When the ships opened, when I saw the tanks drive out, and more ships behind them, and I knew they would never stop. We had been told the Allies were weak, that they could not sustain an invasion, but they did not need to sustain it. They brought everything with them, delivered it onto the beach like a grocer delivering bread. That was when I knew. Not because we were losing the battle. We had lost battles before, but because they had turned war into a delivery service. Zimmermann paused, then added, We were fighting with rifles and machine guns and limited ammunition. They were fighting with an assembly line. How do you defeat an assembly line? The LST remained in service long after D-Day. LSTs participated in the invasion of southern France in August 1944, the Rhine crossings in 1945, and the final push into Germany. In the Pacific, they supported every major amphibious operation from the Philippines to Okinawa. After the war, many were transferred to Allied nations or sold as surplus. Some were converted into merchant vessels. Others were scrapped. A few survive as museum ships, their cavernous tank decks now empty, their bow doors rusted permanently open or shut. But their legacy endures. The LST established the template for modern amphibious assault ships. Every Navy engaged in power projection studies the LST's design, principles. The U.S. Navy's modern amphibious fleet, LHDs, LPDs, LCUs, all trace their lineage to the ungainly, flat-bottomed vessel that drove itself onto the beaches of Normandy. The LST also became, in post-war analysis, a case study in effective innovation. It was not advanced technology. The hydraulic bow doors, diesel engines, and ballast systems were all well-understood engineering. The genius lay in recognizing a need, designing a solution, and producing it at scale. The LST succeeded not because it was sophisticated, but because it was adequate, replicable, and numerous. This lesson, that overwhelming quantity of adequate technology defeats limited quantity of superior technology, became a cornerstone of post-war American military doctrine. The emphasis on standardization, mass production, and logistical excellence that characterized American operations in World War II carried forward into Korea, Vietnam, and beyond. The LST was the symbol of this approach, the proof that a functional solution deployed at scale will defeat an elegant solution deployed in limited numbers. The Germans, who prided themselves on engineering excellence and technological sophistication, learned this lesson too late and at catastrophic cost. Their Panther and Tiger tanks were superior to Shermans in almost every metric, but they were complex, expensive, and produced in limited numbers. A single Tiger cost as much as 4 Shermans. And when the Tiger broke down, as they often did, repairs required specialized parts and skilled mechanics. The Sherman, by contrast, was designed for ease of maintenance and repair, with interchangeable parts and straightforward systems. When a Sherman was destroyed, another was delivered by LST the next day. This was the arithmetic of industrial war. Not better, but more. Not sophisticated, but reliable. Not heroic, but effective. And the bow doors kept opening. There is a memorial on Omaha Beach, overlooking the sand where thousands died. On June 6th, it is a simple monument, listing names and units, marking the ground where courage met machine guns, and some men prevailed and many did not. Tourists visit every year, walking the beach at low tide, photographing the bunkers and monuments, trying to imagine what it was like. But there is another kind of memorial, less formal, that persists in the minds of historians and veterans. It is the memory of the LSTs, grounding themselves on the sand, bow doors opening, tanks rolling out into the surf. It is the image of industrial might applied to the problem of invasion, the moment when logistics became destiny. A British veteran, interviewed decades after the war, described it simply. We practiced and practiced, loading the tanks, driving onto the beach, unloading, retracting. It seemed mad at first, driving a ship onto land. But it worked. And once we saw it work, we knew we'd win. Because if we could do that, if we could drive ships onto beaches and unload tanks in the surf, then we could do anything. And Jerry couldn't stop us, not because he wasn't brave, but because we'd solved the problem, and he was still stuck with the old rules. This ultimately is the truth the LST represented, that modern war is won by those who rewrite the rules, who transform impossibilities into logistics problems, who turn engineering into force. The German defenders of the Atlantic Wall expected an invasion that conformed to historical precedent. They received an invasion that ignored precedent, that drove ships onto beaches and unloaded armies as if distance and ocean were mere inconveniences. The bow doors of the LST opening in the surf were not just a tactical innovation. They were a declaration that the Allies possessed not only superior resources, but superior imagination, not only greater production, but greater audacity, not only more tanks, but more faith in the power of practical solutions to overcome theoretical obstacles. And that faith was justified. The doors opened, the tanks drove out, the beachhead held, and from Normandy to the Rhine, from the Philippines to Okinawa, the pattern repeated. The LST approached, grounded, opened, and delivered the future. The future was loud, mechanical, and relentless. It smelled of diesel and seawater. It came in waves that never stopped, and no Atlantic wall, no matter how thick its concrete or determined its defenders, could hold against a future delivered daily by the hundreds, direct from the ocean, across a door that opened in the surf. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this historical deep dive, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments which historical figure we should cover next.